Thank you. Good evening. Good afternoon. My name is Feliciano. Thank you very much for an invitation, James, to be here. It's a pleasure. It's my first time giving a talk at Brown, the first university that I visited in the United States. So more than almost 20 years ago. So it's a pleasure. Thank you, Ramon, for organizing my talk here. And what I'm going to talk today, is about the foreign policy of President Jair Bolsonaro. As Jean mentioned, I have been studying Brazilian foreign policy for quite some time now, and I specifically studied foreign policy and identity of foreign policy, and that's what I'm going to talk about here today. So this is an ongoing project. It's just my first thoughts about the issues. I never studied populism, far-right populism per se. I always studied foreign policy. But after 10 months of, almost 12 months of Bolsonaro's administration, and the change that he promoted in Brazilian foreign policy are so deep and so different from everything we ever had before, that I, especially when it comes to the identity, Brazil national's identity for foreign policy issues, that I kind of decided to move myself to study the issue and to use everything I've learned about foreign policy and identity to understand this government. So, but I decided instead of studying from only identity and foreign policy perspective, I decided to study, in order to understand the implications of Bolsonaro administration to the foreign policy, I decided to study far-right populism. So in the last 3 or 4 months, I've been reading a lot at Yale, and this sabbatical that I have at Yale, about populism and the implications of far-right populism to foreign policy in general, not only to Brazil, but to Europe and the Americas more recently, right? So, so why did I decide to do that? First of all, due to 2 personal astonishments that happened in 2008. First, the victory of Bolsonaro. I never expected. After the impeachment, I started to feel and read about, and I had a feeling that Bolsonaro was going to win. I never expected that Fernando Haddad was going to. Actually, I worked in the campaign of Fernando Haddad. And I worked in his City Hall campaign, and I was in charge of the international relations chapter of his government program. So I was very close to Haddad. I worked in his campaign for president as well, but I had a feeling since the beginning that Bolsonaro was going to win. So he eventually won. You always have the hope that he's not going to win, but he eventually won. And then I started to have this return of my childhood memories. I'm from Curitiba, where the whole Lava Jato operation started. I'm from a very conservative family in Curitiba, although my parents are not conservative. Everyone in my family is very conservative, Catholic, deep heart conservative, and I thought that the rhetoric that I heard my whole life growing up in Curitiba was simply gone in Brazil. It was like only in Curitiba or in the south, in a few pockets of Brazil. But once Bolsonaro started his campaign, a lot of things started to show up, and a lot of people from my family, not only my relatives, but also friends from high school started to speak out on Facebook, and then I started to have all these memories coming back. So I decided that, well, I have to understand what's going on. So it took me a while to process this whole change in Brazil, and then after 6 months here at Yale, I decided to say, okay, let's go back to these issues, right? So, and what is the puzzle? And when you start to read about Bolsonaro's rhetoric and foreign policy discourse, 2 things that come into mind, right? Most of the populist government, they have 2 very important characteristics, right? Far-right populist foreign policy. They're anti-international institutions, and they are pro-sovereignty, or they're very nationalists. So if you look at their rhetoric, something's not going to work out in international relations. And so how do far-right populists design their foreign policy? By rejecting international institutions and defending national sovereignty in a world where international institutions are increasingly more powerful and national sovereignty is increasingly weakened. And they expect that it will work out. So their rhetoric, their narrative, it's a narrative that goes against what's going on in international institutions especially. So national sovereignty is being weakened worldwide, right? And international institutions are becoming more and more powerful, especially when it comes to international law. And their narrative goes against these 2 very important factors of international relations. So apparently, their foreign policy will never work out. Well, at least we're going to have a huge, a lot of institutions and a lot of other governments will fight against this narrative. So there is something wrong in their narrative in what was going on in world politics. Not only Bolsonaro, but also Trump, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and even Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Right? So what were my goals in this study? Right? My goal is to first analyze how far-right populists build their conservative foreign policy identity. And now analyze how far-right populists create alliances with each other using a conservative foreign policy identity repertoire. So one of the things that strike the most when you start reading and following far right-wing governments worldwide is that they are very close to each other in international affairs. There is a norm diffusion, ideological diffusion amongst them. Right? You know, I was trying to understand how do they ally with each other and how do they use their national identity or the change of national identity they're promoting in their governments to create these alliances. Right? So this is just like it's a draft. I'm starting to think about these ideas, so I'll be very happy to hear from you. So here everything is just pending. It's not I'm not totally sure exactly how this is going to work out. But looking at the cases, and I will talk about the cases a little bit, I identified two types of conservative identities that far-right populists use in their foreign policy narrative. First is what I call thick conservative identity. They usually use a very deep, all-encompassing foreign policy identity repertoire when they negotiate with each other. If you follow Benjamin Netanyahu's and Bolsonaro's negotiations, if you follow Bolsonaro's and Trump negotiations, if you follow Eduardo Bolsonaro, it's not even Jair Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro's son, and Viktor Orban negotiations in Hungary, and then you read their speeches and their discourses after or during these negotiations, you will see that they overlap and they use several different national identities that they are very similar to each other when they negotiate amongst them. But the same governments, when they change who they're negotiating with, they change the narrative, they change this foreign policy identity to a more thin conservative identity. So far-right populists do not repeat this inclination, which is the thick conservative identity that I'm going to explain a little better in a little bit, regarding non-conservative governments or political rivals, preferring to use instead a more nuanced conservative identity conception. So my whole project here is trying to understand the variation between the use of a very deep conservative repertoire in foreign policy to a more thin and nuanced use of conservative identity in foreign policy, right? So what are the three main aspects of most of the far-right populist governments in foreign policy in the world? They have three national role conceptions. I will explain this concept, national role conception, a little bit. But let's first look into these three aspects before. So first one is I already mentioned. They are all anti-globalist. They have all an anti-globalist role. So they have a very strong narrative anti what they call global elites, usually represented by international institutions bureaucrats, right? Or international institutions in general. So the people working for international institutions, whether they are the IMF, the World Bank, or United Nations, right? So they're deep anti-globalist. And they repeat this concept many times in their narrative. A second one, as I already mentioned, is this pro-sovereignty narrative. They're very nationalist. They try to vote and they have a national narrative that emphasizes the importance to recuperate, to bring back national sovereignty. Again, this goes against international institutions, the international laws. There is weakening national sovereignty in the last years. And the last one is what I call anti-foe role or anti-enemy role, right? And this is also very important. All of them have this search for a common enemy narrative, right? They overlap. They have sometimes the same type of enemy. I will explain this a little bit later, right? But they have a very like a Carl Schmittian cleavage of friend and foe, something that you don't see in traditional diplomatic narrative. They spot their what they call the enemy. They even refer to them that way, and they use this as in a very different way that the diplomats are used to. Another enemy of the far-right populists in foreign policies are the diplomats themselves. Their own diplomats in their countries, as you probably can see if you follow Brazilian politics, between Jair Bolsonaro cabinet and Itamaraty and the diplomats, this fight they have between them, in other countries as well. So what I call this deep conservative identity is is these three national roles bind together. So when you have two conservative governments, far-right conservative governments negotiating with each other, this far-right, not traditional conservative governments, but this small number of far-right populists that we're talking about, they have these three national roles combined in their narratives. Both governments, or 3 or 4 governments together. And when they are not negotiating with other conservative government, they will have a more like a thin version of this, which is more nuanced, and I will explain this in a little bit. So what are the cases that I'm going to use Bolsonaro's administration, Bolsonaro's foreign policy, as an illustration of a general trend that is going on with most of the far-right populist government in the world. And I have in this paper 5 sub-cases analysis. So it's the alignment with Donald Trump is the first one that I'm going to talk a little bit of all of them. Alignment with Benjamin Netanyahu. Alignment with theocratic governments in the United Nations Human Rights Council. Unbelievably, Brazil is voting with and exchanging diplomatic cables with Saudi Arabia about many, many issues, especially with family rights and women's rights. The membership that Brazil is trying to become a full member of the OECD. That's another case, and the relationship with China. So we will see that variation of thick and thin identity in this in these 5 cases, right? So I have 4 sources of empirical material that I and my co-author and I have a TA, also at the University of São Paulo, collecting and gathering all this empirical material. First one is interviews. So my co-author spent the last 2 weeks, Irma spent the last 2 weeks in Brasilia collecting some interviews with public officials. We have only 5 interviews so far. Our goal is to interview 10 to 15. It has been difficult to reach out to Brazilian public officials, especially those that are close to the cabinet in Bolsonaro. One of the reasons is because they are anti-university in general, so that is my guess. So because I tried that before with Lula administration, also Cardoso was not that difficult, right? Dilma administration was not that difficult either. Doesn't matter if you're right wing or left wing. If you're coming from an university, it's always difficult. So we're trying to get these interviews. Hopefully by the end of the year, by July next year, we have at least 5 more interviews. The public discourses of at least 8 ministers and 4 special advisors for international relations from July 2018 to July 2020. So we already have more than almost 100 speeches and interviews and discourses. And diplomatic cables from 4 Brazilian embassies: Geneva, Beijing, Washington, Tel Aviv. Through the information law, you can the information law in Brazil allows, it's difficult, but allows for you to have access to no vital, no super secret recent diplomatic cables. And also there is some leakage. Some of the diplomats are leaking to Brazilian news reporters the Brazilian diplomatic cables, and we have on the news, right? So I'm a very good friend of a journalist that is located in Geneva. He studied with me in São Paulo, and the diplomats are just leaking to him some of this, especially those of Saudi Arabia. How hard it shows how hard it is for them as diplomats to have such change in Brazilian foreign policy in the last years, and of course newspaper coverage of most of Brazilian newspaper, but also international newspapers as well. So in order to understand the variation in foreign policy identity, I have to bring to you 2 concepts that are very important in a specific international relations theory that is focused on understand identity and national roles. The first one is called national role conceptions. I mentioned anti-globalist, anti-foe, and nationalist roles. And what are these national role conceptions? Well, national conception is defined as policymakers' own definitions of the general kinds of decisions, commitments, rules, and actions suitable to their state and of functions, if any, their state should perform on a continual basis in international system. So it is their image of the appropriate orientations or functions of their state toward external environment. So you'll see that there is sometimes, maybe you understand identity and national role as synonymous, but they are not synonymous. So when you look at international relations theory about foreign policy and identity, there is a distinction between the two concepts. So usually identity is something that is deeper. You carry your identity for a longer time. So Brazil is a Latin American country. No matter where you are, no matter who you're talking to, you're going to be always Latin American. But Brazil can be a conservative country or can be a progressive country. These are national role conceptions. So they're more unstable, and they vary. National roles, they vary depending on who you're talking to. And this who you're talking to is very important for what we're trying to understand here, which is this what we call the significant other. So in foreign policy analysis, the significant other is something that you try to emulate in foreign policy. It's someone that you think that this government expectations about you should define your own national narrative. And this is very important in this rise of far right-wing populism worldwide, because we have a new significant other, which is other far-right conservative governments, and they emulate each other, right? So more specific, significant other, role theory, which is the name of the theory that invented this concept, uses the concept of significant other to understand how states formulate their own national role conceptions, having in mind others' expectations. Any role conceptualization encompasses an actor's self-image in the perception of its social position vis-a-vis the effects of the other's position and expectations about him or her. So the national role conception will change according to who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to Trump, I will emphasize these three national role conceptions. If I'm talking to China, I might even try to emphasize these three national conceptions, but it won't work out because that's not China's expectations about Brazil. So if you change the significant other, we'll change how these national conceptions will come up and will dominate the national narrative towards that specific country, right? I'll try to explain a little better. So the case interactions will, so far, of what we gather so far, in terms of empirical material, these 5 case interactions will show up like this. So here you have the case, and then you have who is the significant other, who is Brazil talking to, Jair Bolsonaro is talking to, right? And then how these other national role conceptions will pop up in the speeches, in the interviews, in the national narrative, right? So as we explain later, with Bolsonaro and Trump, we will see these 3 types of national conceptions very clearly. And you can see both in Trump's speeches and in Bolsonaro's speeches. If you look at, for example, Bolsonaro's a speech at the United Nations, General Assembly of the United Nations this year, and if you look at Trump's, is one after the other, because Brazil is the first one to give the speech, and the United States is usually the second, right? You see the similarities, and these 3 national role conceptions, they appear beautiful. It was very nice to do the analysis because you can see them they don't refer to each other, but they are talking about the same issues. They're very, very similar on this regard. The same for Bolsonaro and Netanyahu, right? And this will lead to what we call the thick conservative identity formation. When they're negotiating with each other, they emphasize this very deep and encompassing national identity, right? And then the same for we're still making the analysis. This is we don't have so many materials on this case, which is Bolsonaro and Saudi Arabia mostly, in the United Nations Human Rights Council. But you can see, I mean, this is just a speculation so far. I will probably see, the more we gather information, we'll probably see these 3 national conceptions popping up as well. And then these are cases that we'll call more almost like the negative case, right? The cases that prove the other three cases, right? Which is the Bolsonaro OECD negotiations. We won't see these three national role conceptions showing up in the national narrative. It changes completely the national narrative. And with China, in the beginning with the negotiation, well, Bolsonaro was during his campaign, the campaign trial in 2018, China was the enemy, right? Repeating a lot of Trump used to say in his first years in government, right? But as reality takes over, and China is obviously the most important trade partner of Brazil and is the most important investor in Brazil today, Bolsonaro changes its national narrative to China, and you can see this narrative gravitating from a deep conservative in the beginning of his administration to a more nuanced one right now. So the significant other didn't change, it's the same significant other. But maybe the understanding of what the significant other is and the expectations of that significant other towards Brazil force Brazil to change its national identity towards China. Right? This is something that we are analyzing. It's a very interesting case because you see variation within the same case. Right? So what about the literature? Let me get my water here. What about the literature on populism? There is first a growing interest in politics of far-right governments. There's more and more articles coming out. International relations. I'm organizing the International Associations Conference that's going to happen in Honolulu 2020. You're all invited to go. Honolulu is a very nice place. I put together, I'm responsible for the whole conference, so I have 6,000 papers coming up, but I so far identified 8 panels on populism in general, international relations. Yeah, and I looked at the Toronto's conference last year, and there was like 1 or 2. So it's picking up. So there's a growing interest, right? You see more and more articles coming out. So it's good because anything you write, let's say this is a good paper. I don't know if it's going to be, but let's say it's a good paper. Even if it's not a good paper, because we'll be with the first ones about it, so people will quote you. Feliciano didn't understand what's going on. This is going to happen, but at least they will read your paper. So there's a growing interest. So people who want to do some academic work on that, it's very promising. But there is the international aspect of populism is still underexplored, right? Although we have these 8 panels, but it will take some time for people to start to really publish in the papers and the books about it. So there is, and every time you read something about it, they're always saying we need more research on that. More people need to dive in and understand the implications of far-right populism, foreign policy, for global affairs, for this institution, for that institution, and so on. So here we're not analyzing the impact of this type of foreign policy in world affairs, if they're changing international law, we're trying to understand the relationship between their national identity and their performance in foreign policy, right? The impact of this foreign policy is something that we don't know yet, right? So there are some studies on the personal profiles of far-right populist leaders. This is very common. See, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 papers on that, which is trying to understand the personality, the implications of Bolsonaro's personality, Erdogan's personality, what's Prime Minister of India, Modi personality, and so on and so forth. If they are different from no far right-wing or leftist governments or traditional conservative governments or not. So there's a lot of studies on that. We don't necessarily do that. There is studies on how globalization is influencing the rise of right-wing political parties and their foreign policy. And there are some studies about choices for far right-wing populist leaders in terms of identities and roles, right? This paper, Plagiman and Destrati, is the one that analyzes Modi foreign policy in India. It's very interesting because it talks about identity and foreign policy as well. So in order to understand how far-right populists will design its foreign policy, his or her foreign policy, you need to understand the main traits, the main characteristics of populists in general. So there are 2 minimal preconditions for a populist process. This is a very good book about Lau 2005. It's the most influential in the studies of populism. Right? So first, there's a formation of an internal antagonist frontier separating the people, the true people, from power and the elites. So this is the most important characteristic of all far right-wing populist governments, which is division between the people and power, the people and the elites, and the leaders of the far right leaders will try to represent what they call the true people. In one of the authors, they call these leaders, they are sometimes Viktor Orban from Hungary, he talks that way. He wants to purify the country. We've heard of this before, right? He wants to purify the countries. This is the true people. The elite, George Soros, is not the people. Although he's from Hungary, he's not the people. Right? He's the elite. And then there's an equivalent articulation of demands making the emergence of the people possible to overcome and replace the people. The whole strategy of trying to overcome this. So, people versus elite. This is the first and main characteristics of all far right-wing governments nowadays. And the second is what we call the authoritarian component of it. It's composed of three aspects: security, conformity, and loyalty. So security against risks of instability and disorder. So these immigrants are stealing our jobs. This will promote insecurity. We'll fight against immigrants. Right? The second is conformity. You have to conform. That's all my friends at school in Curitiba, they had to conform to what a predominant conservative Catholic society was in the 80s. You cannot defy. I tried to be a professor at the University of São Paulo. That was too much for them. Right? To preserve national traditions. So LGBT are changing and destroying what we understand of family. This is against national tradition, which is the traditional heterosexual family, and anything that challenges that does not conform. The second is loyalty. So in order for these two to be security and conformity, you have to be loyal. Loyal to whom? Loyal to a leader, right? Influential leaders who protect the group customs and traditions. Right? This is Norway's Englehart definition of the components of authoritarian far right-wing governments. Right? So it's majorities acting as mistreated minorities. And it's by definition almost anti-democratic, right? Undemocratic. So there is a very good book from Francis Fukuyama. It's called Identity Politics, maybe. It's 2008. He called these authoritarian components of far right-wing populism as the resentment politics, right? The result of this process is what Francis Fukuyama has called resentment politics. The populist leader can translate any economic loss or social threat into a loss of identity and status. You have always been a core member of our great nation, and your elite compatriots have been conspiring to hold you down. Your country is no longer your own. You are estranged in your own land. The raison d'être of far-right populists is to defend nativism, an ideology which holds that states should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, right, the nation. And those non-native elements are threatening the nation-state homogeneity, which is a conformity. That's why this is the logic behind anti-immigrant politics. Will be interesting to analyze in Brazil is that Brazil has no immigrants, right? Brazil is today the country in the world that has the lowest number of foreigners in national territories. Only 0.2% of the people in Brazil were born abroad. It's by far the lowest. It's lower than Japan or Russia, usually the two countries that are seen with low numbers of immigrants. No one immigrates to Brazil. Almost no foreigners. Even in the Venezuelan crisis, only less than 100,000 immigrate to Brazil. Brazil is 210 million people. People who know Brazil, if you're in Paulista Ave, or if you're in Botafogo, Flamengo, or Copacabana, you'll see some foreigners. But if you walk 1 kilometer away from there, no foreigners anymore. I'm married to, my wife is American, we lived in Brazil for 7 years. In Curitiba, for example, there's no foreigners. I used to walk with her and talk in English in the mall, people look at us like that. whoa, they're so cute, they speak English. It's almost like, because they don't see, there are no foreigners in Brazil. There are no jobs. For many reasons, we can talk about that in the Q&A later. But still, Bolsonaro articulates an anti-immigration narrative. It's not predominant in his government, but it's there. It's this sort of emulation amongst far right-wing governments. So we have the paper here. This is the difficult part of the paper, which is trying to translate these two main characteristics of far right-wing governments, which is people versus elite, and in the authoritarian component, in national role conceptions regarding international relations, right? So I think this is going to be the most challenging aspect of the paper, which is try to explain each one of these three national role conceptions, which is the anti-globalist. This is the easiest one. So external or internal sources of conspirators identify international agencies and global elite. So there is a narrative to fight against international bureaucrats and to defend the true people, and a narrative to fight against diplomats or diplomatic corporations to defend the true people. They don't represent the people anymore. Right? This is very common in the Bolsonaro administration. This is the predominant narrative. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The second one is the nationalist, far-right populist, and strong support of national sovereignty. It's not very clear exactly what it means. This national sovereignty, because it's very hard for them to articulate this in international institutions, not only because they're against international institutions, it's because these countries have signed so many international treaties that bind them now that it's very hard for them to overcome or reverse all these international treaties that they have signed. For example, in the human rights area, this is what's going on in Brazil, right? Brazil wants to almost reverse international human rights treaties that Brazil has signed, but it just can't do that. Even if it does, there's going to be a backlash. And this anti-foe, which is also very important. This is called Schmittian friend and foe, almost fascist, traditional fascist. This is my enemy, we have to fight this guy, right? So the targets are usually the left, any government that is left wing, immigrants, LGBT, women, and etc. So this will also show up in international and foreign policy, right? So now look at the Bolsonaro's foreign policy itself. When you start to read the first, there aren't like academic papers out there about Bolsonaro's foreign policy yet. There are some that are more or less academic. Like you read in this foreign policy magazine, or some of these think tanks in US will publish one or two papers about that. They're not like academic per se, but they're talking about important aspects of Bolsonaro's administration. So when you read these papers, everybody talks about there are three groups inside Bolsonaro's administration trying to control the foreign policy narrative, which is the military, the ideological, something that we will call here the anti-globalist group, and the neoliberal. Right? And after studying, and I kind of bought this argument. I thought, okay, there are three groups fighting against each other within Bolsonaro's administration, trying to control the national narrative in terms of foreign policy. But at the end of the day, after analyzing this five, I have like 7 cases actually. I have 5 cases, and the other 2 that we're thinking about to include, which is one of them is the crisis around the Amazon fires, right? We realize that when it comes to foreign policy, only 2 groups actually are disputing the national, trying to control the foreign policy narrative, which is the neoliberals and anti-globalists. So militaries in general have been sidelined. They are losing power within Bolsonaro's administration. The most important ones, they either got fired or they got demoted, and they're losing. And I think it's starting to become it's starting to have like a sort of a rivalry between a lot of Bolsonaro militaries and the cabinet, the people who are close to Bolsonaro. And these people who are very close to the president have more influence on foreign policy. So, and these it's going to be very important in our paper because, depending who Bolsonaro is talking to, if it's Trump, if it's Benjamin Netanyahu, or if it's the membership of OCDE, these factions within the government will change in terms of their control, their influence in the national narrative and these national role conceptions, right? So and these are the people who are more or less around these two factions, right? The most important one is Ernesto Araújo, which is the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I think actually the most influential in terms of foreign policy of the two, of them all in the whole administration is Felipe Martins. He was my student. He studied, his student, something happened there. He studied, I don't know, he studied FAAP. I don't know if you guys FAAP. It's a private, super expensive, for the super rich college in São Paulo. He studied there. He's 35 years old. He's very influential. He's very close to Bolsonaro. His cabinet is right across Bolsonaro's cabinet, which means he's every day there. He's more influential than Ernesto Araújo, for example. And Eduardo Bolsonaro, which is Bolsonaro's son, who is a House of Representative, and he's also the chair of the committee, International Relations Committee of the House. He was almost a Brazilian ambassador to the United States, and they knew that the Senate will never approve the president's son to be ambassador, so he sort of gave up on that position, but he's still very influential. So these are the two most influential people close to Bolsonaro. And then there is the new liberal faction, which is represented mainly by Paulo Guedes, who is the Minister of Economics. He's very powerful because when Bolsonaro started his administration, he made a reform in the ministries, so he combined several ministries under Paulo Guedes. So Paulo Guedes is not only Minister of Economics, but he's almost the president of the central bank. He appointed someone there, but the guy is totally his appointee, has no say. When it comes to interest rate in Brazil, is the Minister of Economics that talks about, is not the president of the central bank. So Paulo Guedes has gathered a lot of power in the last 10 months. Tereza Cristina is also very important. She's like a low-profile Minister of Agriculture. She's very efficient, and she's very active in international relations. And she's she's traveling all the time, trying to fix some of the problems that Bolsonaro has made over the months, or trying to push the agenda of Paulo Guedes in international relations, right? So this is going back to the disposition of cases, and now we can talk about, I don't know how long I have. We talk
5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes. We can talk a little bit about the cases, right? We're building the cases. So the paper, I'll give you my email at the end of the presentation, and anyone who wants the draft by November 29th, we have to finish the draft to submit to a conference that we're going to present this paper in London in December. So we're almost there. We have 20-something pages. So at least 2 cases are going to be in this draft, which is Bolsonaro and Trump, and I think the Bolsonaro in China, which is they are very different from each other, right? So how do we do it in terms of analyzing each case? So we gather all the evidence we have of the different sources that we have. There is an imbalance in the sources, right? This is a very recent. We have a historian here, knows very well. I can never make it. We're not trying to explain causality. So we're not trying to explain this lead to that and this factor lead to that one. And we're trying to understand in the national narrative how Brazil portrays itself vis-a-vis the other. So we have to look at how Bolsonaro administration designs Brazil national identity and national role conceptions in these interviews and in his speeches, right? And we're trying to compare this type of narrative with the same narrative that the other government is doing. So Trump or Netanyahu or Xi Jinping, so on and so forth. So we try to find similarities between the two. And if we have better diplomatic cable of negotiations, for example, these ones at the United Nations Human Rights Council, it's very interesting because you can see the cables that Brazil is negotiating with Saudi Arabia a vote in the United Nations and the Human Rights Council. So we can explain not only that their narrative is similar, but they're negotiating to vote this way or that way in an international institution, right? So as I said, for example, if you look at the United Nations General Assembly speech 2018, you see a lot of this reinforcing nationalist, anti-globalist, even in this anti-foe, right? So usually for Bolsonaro, the foe, the big enemy is not only Lula but the left in general. We have this hallucinating Fórum de São Paulo. They overestimate tremendously the capacity of I wish the left was so powerful, but this is not even close to what he overestimates. So this is the biggest enemy of Bolsonaro administration in terms of international relations. Fórum de São Paulo, for those who don't know, it's a loose organization of leftist government that was created in São Paulo in the early ages of the Workers' Party, and they just get together sometimes to exchange policy experience, and there's no articulation of political decisions based on Foro de São Paulo. So this is Bolsonaro's, and is most of the time in his speech, this is the greatest foe of his administration. But you also see him emulating other far right-wing governments, especially when it comes to immigrants. There is a 2018 during his campaign trial interview that he gives to Estado de São Paulo, which is unbelievable what he says about immigrants. Right? They have to get out. The Venezuelans they are all leftists infiltrating Brazil. We're not gonna help them. Once he starts his administration, he sees that the operation that the army is doing on the border with Roraima state is actually very good. The way the United Nations is recommended the Brazil operation as one of the most successful operations when it comes to immigration in large numbers, which is the army operation in Roraima border. And then he sees the situation is much more complex than that, but he still gives one interview and 2 or 3 speeches saying that immigration in general is really bad. Eduardo Bolsonaro comes to the United States and said that Brazilians here in the United States, Brazilian immigrants in the United States, should be expelled from the United States because this will destroy the United States and American way of life. I mean, he's giving a speech against his own nationals in America because he's like emulating this. So, so in these cases, like in the relationship with Trump, especially on the state visit that Bolsonaro did recently here in the United States and the 2 state visits, you see this domestic faction, which is the anti-globalists, taking over. You see Ernesto Araújo, you see Felipe Martins, especially Felipe Martins, taking control of the whole negotiation with Trump. So you won't see Paulo Guedes' faction with Trump, which is unbelievable. It's like, well, I mean, they block Paulo Guedes. Because there is one important thing about Bolsonaro that is very different from Trump, Viktor Orbán, or even Benjamin Netanyahu. He's not a nationalist in terms of economic policy. Right? This is a very big difference. If you look at Trump, he's like, we have to protect American jobs. He uses this tariff policy against China. He's very nationalistic in terms of economic policy. And Bolsonaro, amazingly, is not like that in this issue. And then you see how Paulo Guedes is powerful. And that creates a contradiction in the government. We will see, which is the OECD case. Right? When Brazil, in order to Brazil to join the OECD, Brazil has to accept the influence of OECD over Brazil, which goes against the pro-sovereignty narrative of the government. So in general, Brazil goes against international institutions. Brazil is not paying the United Nations anymore. Brazil, after the United States, Brazil is second in terms of debt towards the United Nations. And Bolsonaro has said he's not going to pay. He needs to weaken the United Nations in general. Brazil can even lose his vote, his rights to speak in the United Nations if he continues not paying like that. Dilma has had similar problems in his administration, also with all the problems in budgetary problems in her administration. But once Temer became the president, and Serra was the minister, Brazil paid off United Nations, and now Brazil is on that again. But for example, when it comes to OECD, Brazil is fully in favor of joining the OECD. You have Ernesto Araújo talking about OECD, but actually you see Paulo Guedes taking control of that case. So for example, so we have no OECD, we have no evidence of the anti-globalist narrative. This national conception, when you look at this case, when Brazil is negotiating with the OECD, this national concept does not appear in the narrative. You have no evidence of the anti-sovereignty rhetoric found in Guedes and Ernesto Araújo, which is Ernesto Araújo is the biggest anti-globalist against international institutions in most of his speeches. But when it comes to OECD, he doesn't say a word of it. It's Paulo Guedes who fully control this negotiation. So there is a variation on what conservatism should be in Bolsonaro's administration. So domestic fashion that is state control is the new liberal. Right? And then we have also the theocratic governments. Right? You see all these 3 national conceptions very clear in the narrative. They overlap each other. Sometimes it's hard to separate, disentangle these 2 national conceptions in the narrative. So Bolsonaro and Saudis on abortion, LGBT, and women's rights, and reproductive rights, evidence, voting record in United Nations Human Rights Council. Brazil has changed. Brazil got elected again for 4 more years, I think, for the United Nations Human Rights Council, and is creating this alliance with Saudi Arabia and other very conservative countries. You see Damares. I forgot to talk about Damares. Damares is the human rights minister in Brazil. She comes from a very extreme evangelical faction in Brazil. She became the minister, and she's very vocal in the traditional conservative issues of abortion, LGBT rights, and women's rights in general. And she has taken almost control with Ernesto Araújo in these issues. In Geneva, human rights ministry in Brazil never had so much influence on these issues. In Geneva, it was always Itamaraty, was always the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? And you have this, and then you have overlapping, which is a little difficult to separate because there's another thing. Although they don't say it, one of the foes, one of the enemies of Bolsonaro administration is Islamism in general. They repeat what some of the extreme right-wing governments in Europe do, right? Especially Viktor Orban. But Brazil doesn't have a big Islamic population within the country, but Brazil has very strong ties with the Arab world in general, right? And Bolsonaro has had some issues with this area when decided to move the Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Right? So most of the Arab countries went against Bolsonaro. They changed the policy. Brazil is not going to do that. Brazil is just going to open like an office in Jerusalem. He's not going to go that far. But he is very interesting because although he doesn't say it very clearly, in the interviews that we had with the two diplomats, they refer to this issue that they are anti-Muslims in general, and they talk about that in their meetings. But now they're like signing with Saudi Arabia and other conservative Muslim countries in the United Nations Human Rights Council. So there's always this strategic factor going against or create a contradiction with the identity construction. Yeah? So I haven't understood that well. We're trying to understand how that works. This is a very difficult case, as the case with China is. And the Netanyahu is the one that we haven't built that yet, the case. All right. And I think, for example, this is a speculation, right? We don't have the evidence yet. For example, this anti-foe, right? Brazil has participated in UNIFIL. Is that how you say in English? I don't know if I put it in Portuguese. I think it's UNIFIL, right? United Nations. It's a Navy mission that tries to prevent arms smuggling in the Lebanon. So Brazil was in charge of this United Nations. It's the only United Nations mission with Navy in the world. And the moment Brazil, Bolsonaro administration started, Benjamin Netanyahu started to push Brazil to withdraw the Brazilian Navy from the operation. What happened is Brazil has been doing this for over 10 years almost. And every time an aircraft, fighter jet, flies out from Israel, it shows the Brazilian radars in the Navy vessels. So Brazil has the entire Israeli Air Force marks over 10 years. So there is a Navy, if there is a Navy in the world that knows how the Israeli Air Force operates, it's the Brazilian Navy. Because it's very, very close, right? And this always bugged Israel, right? And Israel in general is against UNIFIL, right? Although they needed UNIFIL there, but in general, this is a problem. The moment the Brazil Bolsonaro administration started, Benjamin Netanyahu said, could you please withdraw your Navy from there? Also, the military in Brazil is very expensive to keep the operation there. So there's all these budgetary constraints that might be influencing the situation. Brazil is finally withdrawing its vessels from this operation. Right? And I'm not sure if the Navy is in favor of withdrawing, because they have learned a lot in this operation. For the Navy is important. Right? And maybe this anti-foe. So who is the enemy here? So if Benjamin Netanyahu tells Bolsonaro, so the enemy is everyone around us, is Iran against us, it's Hezbollah, it's whoever, especially Hezbollah, any Hezbollah operation, because the Brazilian Navy raiders Brazil has a more or less good technology in terms of this Navy capacity. So also all the Hezbollah operations there in the northern border of Israel, Brazil it's been studying this for over I don't know how long. Right? So I think we're. So what are the conclusions so far? This is all tentative. There's nothing certain yet. We're developing the paper as I mentioned. So first, identity matters for ultra-conservative foreign policy, right? Is a less strategic foreign policy that looks into correlations of forces and traditional who has more power in this area or on the other area, and is more identity related. Right? There is an identity variation according to significant others. So depending on who Brazil is talking to, these identities will change. These national role conceptions will change. This is not counterintuitive. It's kind of, okay, we expect that happens. We're trying to understand how it happens. And this is a little more difficult to understand because we need more evidence, which is there is this identity variation according to whom Brazil is negotiating with is supported by different domestic factions. Right? So there is this dispute between these two factions. And depending on who Brazil is negotiating with, one of the domestic factions will control the narrative. And I think that's what's happening with China now. Right? You had the anti-globalists and Néstor Araújo controlling what Brazil would say about China. It didn't work well. It was very harmful. The Chinese are very professional. The diplomatic corps is very professional. So they with Brazilian vice president, they said, look, we cannot do there like too much. This rhetoric is going too far, and then reality kicks in, and Bolsonaro is starting to change, and then you see Paulo Guedes' faction taking over, right? And there is a multiple conservative national conception overlapping one negotiation with other conservative governments, which is this three national conceptions overlapping each other: the anti-full, anti-globalist, the pro-sovereignty, nationalist. And these alliances are forged in an identity-sharing process. Right? So they recognize each other, two conservative governments, they recognize each other, and they build their alliances in this. When you look at the literature on alliances, this is one of the reasons most of the literature on alliances is like you have common interests. That's why you ally with each other in international relations, right? There is, of course, some studies that show that if you have identity sharing, you also ally. Right? And so these studies will bring evidence to that literature. So I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for the question.
We have at least 15 minutes for questions, so people should feel free to ask. And you can call on people. I'll always ask the first question if no one else will.
Questions? Please, just say your name.
Thank you, Feliciano. How do you apply your analysis for Brazil relations with Latin American countries? For example, in the case of Venezuela or recent events in Bolivia, I think you can identify anti-foe, as you know. But for example, not with Argentina, Mercosur negotiations maybe are more related to the second faction led by Paulo Guedes. And now with the election of the new government in Argentina, do you think that can be a change in anti-foe politics ideology will be applied also to Mercosur?
Thank you very much for your question.
Just answer it. Yeah.
Right. So in Latin America, I think the first thing I can say to you is that there is no other far right-wing government as Bolsonaro. Right? You don't see, in South America especially, no other president that is as far to the right as Bolsonaro is. Right? And no one probably I don't see anyone, maybe in Chile with all this a lot of people are saying that there is this extreme right-wing candidate in Chile that is doing very well during this whole problem that is going on in Chile nowadays. So Bolsonaro has not found another partner in the same level that he finds with Trump or Viktor Orbán in Hungary. So that's the first aspect, right? taking that into consideration, we have a lot of other right-wing governments in the region. We have the Chilean government. We used to have the Argentinian government, right? You have the Colombian government. So you see Bolsonaro, of course, approaching these governments, but it's not in the same. It's not in the same. It doesn't have for Bolsonaro, unbelievably, it doesn't have for Bolsonaro the same importance of the alliances that Bolsonaro is building with Trump, or even Benjamin Netanyahu when Benjamin Netanyahu was still in power, or even like faction within the Italian government before the last election of Italy, right? And one of the reasons is because Latin America, for the whole Bolsonaro administration, is not seen as an important. Is seen as important, right? But is seen more as a problem than an opportunity. Right? So since the beginning of the administration, that's what I see in most of Bolsonaro's, especially Paulo Guedes' speeches towards any other Latin American country. Right? So the foe is Venezuela, and I think that Venezuela represents. So this anti-foe aspect, national conception, will always show up in any negotiation in the region. It will definitely not be the case with Argentina anymore. But I think in the case of Argentina, what we will see is the domestic faction of Paulo Guedes will more or less control of how you negotiate with Argentina. You won't see with Argentina the anti-globalists, Felipe Martins and Néstor Araújo, so prominent in the way you negotiate with Argentina. There is going to be like a freezing of the relationship, but they're not going to go that far to break relationships or for Brazil to withdraw, to exit to the Mercosur. I don't think it will go that far. But this is the first aspect. In Latin America, that's one of the reasons we have no Latin American cases here. Because I was trying to understand how two far right-wing governments will negotiate with each other. Right? And in Latin America, you see no other. Maybe in Colombia will be the closest one, but it's not as close as it's not as extreme to the right as Bolsonaro is. So. So it's always going to be complicated for his administration to build up relationships in Latin America, unless there is another guy like him, or similar to his administration. This is a new politics of alignment. If you look at the Brazilian foreign policy literature, they talk about autonomy versus alignment, right? And alignment was always alignment with the United States, regardless of the American president. Now it's an alignment, but it's not an alignment with the United States. It is an alignment with Trump. If tomorrow the American president is changed, Brazil will not ally with the United States. It will change. So, because it's not gonna, they're emulating each other. It's a global conservative movement. They just had the CPAC meetings in São Paulo. Irma, my co-author, went there. She spent 2 times 10 hours listening to what they're speaking. One of the moments she had to walk away, go to the bathroom to cry a little bit and come back because it's so aggressive. And it's always Trump, Tea Party, very extremist right-wing groups within the Republican Party. It's not even the Republican Party in general. So it's a new politics of alignment. It's not the same alignment that we see during Dutra administration, during Castelo Branco administration, or even during Collor administration. If Trump continues to be the American president, fine. But if he is not, Brazil will have to change. It will be very odd. Let's say Elizabeth Warren is the next president, or even Bernie Sanders. He will change automatically. So it's not alignment in the United States. That's different from before. If you look at it, because every alignment period in Brazil was very short, right? So I can't recollect now, but maybe during Dutra administration there was a change in American government, but I don't think so.
Under Dutra?
Under Dutra.
Yeah, Truman went to
Truman to Roosevelt, but the alignment continued.
Roosevelt to
Roosevelt to Truman, and Truman to Eisenhower. I think Eisenhower.
52, exactly.
No, Eisenhower 52. Yeah. So this is something to be seen, right? So I don't know. I didn't answer you because this was something that was in my mind all the time in Latin America, but as I was trying to understand how these extreme far right-wing governments create alliances, and I see no similar government in Latin America, so we put this aside. James.
No, I defer to others.
You?
Yeah,
Please.
I have 2 questions. The first one is, so in alignment with other extreme far right governments, how much, what role do economic interests play, if at all, or is it purely ideological? And in the case, for example, with like Arab countries. And the second is, so in his immigration narrative, given that there's not that much immigration to Brazil right now, do you think that's mostly seeking alignment, like internationally, or is it also directed towards like a national audience? And if so, why is it effective if there's not that many migrants?
Very good questions. Are there more questions?
If you'd like to.
I think he had a.
Yeah, I was just curious if there's any way in which the far-right media ecosystem plays into these alliances before maybe they're formally made from like a from a policy standpoint. Like, is there any
Yes, they have a role.
of people connecting Trump and Bolsonaro before they've made that connection themselves, for example?
So I'm going to ask you a question that's not a part of your research, but maybe you can answer it, which is Russia, which I don't think there are very many economic interests between Brazil and Russia at this point. I can't think of anything that.
Brazil is Russia supplies Brazil with agriculture, insumos da agricultura. Brazil doesn't have potassium, so Brazil has a huge production of agriculture crops in general.
So potassium from Russia to Brazil
relies on 90%.
What is Brazil exporting to Russia?
So not much. So Brazil has a trade deficit, huge trade deficit with Russia.
So, but still, because of the way in which
Russia.
configurations of Russia, I also want to say this is a fabulous talk. I'm really glad you presented it. It's helping me think about a lot of things which I didn't understand. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes?
I'm curious how you understand Bolsonaro supporters living abroad, specifically in the States, how they understand his foreign policy when like they are suffering greatly under parallel policies under the Trump administration. I heard Jean-Louis speak yesterday at Harvard about his interactions with the Brazilian community in Boston, who many of whom are undocumented, and they really dislike Donald Trump for the suffering that they've experienced
But they like Bolsonaro.
living here, but they like Bolsonaro. So how do you think Bolsonaro supporters sort of like square that or reconcile this sort of cognitive dissonance?
Any more? Right. It's about your question about the economic issues in general, right? So, as I briefly mentioned in the presentation, Bolsonaro is different from other far-right governments in the world because it doesn't have this nationalist economic policy very clearly. Today, in the newspaper, Bolsonaro created Brazil's latest state company, which is a byproduct of a state company that Brazil is privatizing. Right? The last one was created by Dilma, right? And Brazil has 200 and something state companies already. Still, they try to privatize a lot, and there was a lot of all the right-wing media in Brazil was thinking, how can a guy like him with Paulo Guedes can create a state-owned company, right? I think this is something that I cannot fully understand and answer to you. I think when it comes to these governments of these relationships between far right-wing governments that I looked with Bolsonaro, economic issues in general are always second, which is, it goes against the traditional for Brazilian foreign policy, which is trade is always first. Brazil has no military issues, has no strategic issues. No one will go to war against Brazil, right? We have no problem whatsoever, which is unbelievable, amazing for Brazil, right? So trade issues and economic issues in general were the main aspects of any Brazilian foreign policy. Is development and trade since 1940s at least, right? And when you see these negotiations, this is what is different from before. This is one of the aspects that is different from before. Economics is always second. You can only reach the economics if you figure out an alliance with these values, right? And then Paulo Guedes' faction will play a role, but it's always going to be a secondary role with Israel during Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll see now if he's going to continue to be prime minister or not. Trump, you can see that it's very difficult for Brazil and the United States to come up with a trade deal, right? Because Brazil's main exportations compete with American exportations, especially agricultural sector. So there's a lot of interest in the U.S. for Brazil not to sign any trade agreement, for the United States not to sign any trade agreement with Brazil, right? It's the opposite in China. China needs to buy everything that comes from Brazil. Everything Brazil exports, China needs to buy. So it's easier for Brazil to negotiate anything related to economics with China. But the United States is always second. And if you look at the relationship, it's never there. Paulo Guedes participates in the state visit, It's important to remember that he's not only the Minister of Economics, but he's also controlled the Minister of how is called now the Minister of Ministério do Desenvolvimento, Ministério de Exportações, como é que chamava? MDIC. Is it still MDIC? He also controls MDIC, which is the minister responsible for foreign trade, right? But he's never there. So, and that's interesting because if you look at all the other far-wing governments, economic policy is always important for them, but not for Bolsonaro. So that makes Bolsonaro administration different from the others. And it's very important for Bolsonaro, right? Bolsonaro can never lose this faction. He can never alienate Paulo Guedes in his administration. Anyone who follows Brazilian politics will know that he relies on this faction. It's very important. Most of Brazilian CEOs will support Paulo Guedes. Most of Brazilian companies, most of Brazilian media support Paulo Guedes first and Bolsonaro second. So he cannot lose this faction. The immigration. I just finished an article where I work with public opinion too, right? This is foreign policy and identity and public opinion. These are my two main research agendas. We run surveys in Brazil. So we are the only, University of São Paulo is the only one that has a national survey only for international relations. So we make almost 100 questions to Brazilians in a national sample of 1,800 people every 4 years. So we started in 2008 and we're finishing up the 2019 sample. And we always made questions about immigrations. And Brazilians they love immigrants. If you look, what do you think of Americans? They love. By the way, in Latin America, Brazilians are the one who love Americans the most by far. In any polls will show that. Right? Like Mexicans are more or less. Brazilians love it. Any American who go to Brazil will realize that in 5 minutes. Right? You know that very well. Maybe in the left, the two people in the left they don't like, but all the rest of the country they love. They love foreigners in general. There's no, but these are open questions, right? So no one who dislike a foreigner will tell to a survey, so someone doing a survey, I don't like people from Lebanon. They'll never say that. It's the same problem. So you have to come up with this sort of, there are some tricks that you do in the survey to protect the interviewee, for him or her to give the answer what he really thinks about foreigners. So we ran a survey experiment on that, and we create fictitious scenarios in which a foreigner competes with for jobs, for SUS, which is the healthcare system, for schools, and then Brazilians hate foreigners. Unbelievably. The numbers are strikingly bad. Hopefully our paper will be published next year. I can share this paper and the results with you. It's really bad by any international standards. And its most striking is that there are no foreigners to compete with you. And we have a second question in the service, they will tell you how many foreigners you think there is in Brazil, and they will say 40% of Brazilians are foreigners. So the title of the article is Misperception. There's a huge misperception. It's common for immigration in general. People overestimate immigrants in every country, but in Brazil, it's just the numbers are too far. They are not informed on that. It's hard to tell that Bolsonaro knows this. No, he doesn't know. They don't. Of course, the administration doesn't know our study. No, but it's hard to tell if he knows that Brazilians don't like foreigners. But he might be appealing to this public, right? See, foreigners are going to compete for your job. But as I said, he doesn't say that often. It's here and there. So he's either emulating Trump, because this is the whole part of the most important issues in Europe for any far right-wing government in Europe, important in the United States. So Bolsonaro emulates that. I think this is a better explanation than the alternative explanation is that Bolsonaro knows that Brazilians don't like, so he says that because he wants to get votes from Brazilians in general. But I don't think that's the case. It's just a coincidence, right? About the far right media ecosystem, right? When I think it was your question. I think in America you guys know someone called Stephen Bannon, right? And he's almost a Brazilian now. He's like best friend with Eduardo Bolsonaro. He was responsible for organizing the CPAC meeting that happened last month in São Paulo, which is a conservative conference, global conference, whatever. He's very influential in policy in Brazil. there is speculation that he's actually advising not only Eduardo Bolsonaro, but also Ernesto Araújo, but also Felipe Martins on policy making in Brazil. I think this is too far. They're not going to go that far. So one of the very interesting things to study, and I have an advisee who's probably going to do her master's, that is trying to understand the role of this far right-wing media, especially here in the United States, to the creation of this international global conservative movement that is happening in Europe, in the United States, and Brazil is joining in now. We don't know exactly their role, and they truly work as magnets. So they have Italians, Brazilians, Hungarians, Turkish, even from India, the extreme right-wing nationalist government in India, they connect to this. So they work as a magnet, and also they do norm diffusion, right? And also the ecosystem of the same blogs in Brazil. There are many far right-wing blogs similar to what Stephen Bannon does in Brazil, and they emulate Americans on the area as well. So this is very interesting to understand. I don't know if I'm going to quote Stephen Bannon, because this is almost like this, because they're everything for Bolsonaro administration, there is a conspiracy behind, right? They love conspiracy theories, right? It's everywhere. This photo de São Paulo thing is a conspiracy theory. So sometimes I think that the way we read Stephen Bannon is also a conspiracy theory. We overemphasize his role. So I'm not sure if I'm going to use. I have a lot of things that he said, interviews. His interview has an interview with Olavo de Carvalho, which is an intellectual. I don't know how to call him here. A Brazilian who lives in the U.S. is very influential in the Bolsonaro administration. So this is something I'm still trying to understand. But this is something to be studied, right? Russia. My intuition says that in terms of foreign policy identity, Bolsonaro and Vladimir Putin are very close to each other. But you have to remember that Russia is one of the most important enemies of far right-wing governments in Europe, especially those who are closest to Russia, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Romania. If you look at the far-wing governments, there are Italy or France. Russia is not the enemy. Sometimes it's even the ally. So there is within far right-wing groups in Europe, Russia is either the enemy or the ally. Russia has been always the enemy, right? And now it's becoming ally for some of these groups. So I think that they tend to be close partners, Vladimir Putin and Bolsonaro. But Russia's allies, most closest partner in Latin America, were the leftist government, especially in Venezuela. So there's a strategic component that goes against this theoretical alliance, possible alliance between Bolsonaro and Vladimir Putin. And if you look at the BRICS negotiation, Brazil is a member of the BRICS, so it's all the time negotiating many issues with Russia, right? It's very important. BRICS is key for Brazilian foreign policy because it gives direct access to Russia, China, and India, something that Brazil didn't have before BRICS. Even Bolsonaro will never withdraw Brazil from BRICS because it gives access to the most important powers in the world in a way that Brazil didn't have before BRICS, right? So maybe something will develop from there, because Brazil has closer and closer relationship with Russia, but I don't know how far that will go. I think the strategic component for Russia is key. It's more important than any other ideological far right-wing similarities between the two. That's my guess. About your question about Bolsonaro living abroad, I'm a Brazilian living in the United States. My wife is American. I'm close to some Brazilians who live in Connecticut, where I live now, and they are, like Jean Willy said, they're almost like, if you look at the votes, because they can vote, and if you look at the America and Japan were the countries where Haddad lost. Overseas voters, Haddad won. If you look at France, for example, he won by 80% of the votes. Germany, 80% of the votes. Italy was a little less, 50%.
Israel, Haddad lost.
Israel, Haddad lost, which is also symptomatic of what's going on. In U.S., Bolsonaro won by a large margin, right? And there are many Brazilians abroad. No one immigrates to Brazil. Brazilians don't move from Brazil. Like the number of Brazilians in the United States is below 1 million people, but Brazil again has 210 million people. So if you compare to any Latin American countries, the share of Brazilian population is very, very low. You see them concentrated in Massachusetts, in Florida, and there are no other places you see Brazilians. Brazilians don't immigrate from Brazil either. Right? There are no waves. The numbers are very, very small compared to the size of the population. So it's hard. They have vote in Brazil. They have this role, but they are not articulated politically. They are not like the Mexicans in the United States, who are very well articulated in Mexican domestic affairs. The Brazilian population in the United States is not very well articulated politically speaking. And the majority of them want to go back to Brazil. So majority of Brazilians who live in the United States, they see the United States as a temporary moment of their life. They want to move back. And there are some polls showing that, which is different from most of Latin American countries. If you're from Minas Gerais, then it's different. Mineiros in general, they want to stay. They have a tradition to stay. And the polls you can separate this in the pool. But in general, they want to move back. But their influence in Brazilian politics is almost zero. It's hard to understand. I'm just speculating. How can you? They're obviously against Trump because of all the immigration policy Trump has had in the last years that goes against immigration in general, in a way that is, at least in terms of rhetoric, much worse than Obama. But then they support Bolsonaro. You have to take in consideration something that I didn't mention here, which is the evangelical groups within Bolsonaro's administration. Right? I haven't put this in the paper because it's the representative of the evangelical groups, the extreme evangelical groups, is Damares, especially Damares. Bolsonaro is very close to many far right-wing bishops and pastors in Brazil. He's all the time going there. It's the first time, although he's Catholic himself, his wife is evangelical, and he's the first one outspoken in favor of evangelicals in any administration in Brazil. This is something that the left in Brazil has lost completely in an unbelievable way, and by IBGE, which is the Brazilian Statistics Institute, by 2050, will be 40% Catholics and 40% evangelicals. Now it's 60-25. Brazil will be the only country in Americas that will change from Catholicism to Christians in general without a civil war, hopefully, right? The only country in Americas that will change the predominance. Evangelicals will be majority in Brazil. They're growing, and they grow rapidly, and they continue to grow in the last 20 years. Unless there's something happen that they will stop, might stop because the Catholics are now losing people anymore, but we don't know. So this is hard. I think will give you, if you look into that direction, it will give you an answer why Brazil, because a lot of the majority of Brazilians who live in the United States are evangelicals. They immigrate more than Catholics, right? And they're younger too. So this is another component that could explain why, because they will say, okay, Bolsonaro is against immigrants. The immigrants radical Bolsonaro is not very clear for them, as I mentioned, because it's not there all the time. So maybe they don't even know that Bolsonaro is against immigrants. That's something to investigate. And second, Bolsonaro represents the traditional Brazilian family. It's the true people. It's the way that Brazil should be. Is the comeback to what Brazil used to be during dictatorship. It is fictional creation, a crazy idea that Brazil was better off during dictatorship than it is today, despite of all the evidence on the contrary in all areas, right? So this might be playing a role in how Brazilians here in the United States still like Bolsonaro. But Bolsonaro in general, his polls, his numbers are going down. So I think that's a trend. But he will keep this 20%, 30% of the votes in the next election. This is very hard to change. It's there, right? So he's still very competitive for the next election.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.